When the FK2 was unveiled in 2014, quite a few people looked at it and went, oh no, what have they done? Styling wise, it was way more aggressive than any Type R before it. And it needed all that kind of aero work because it was supposed to be the fastest front-wheel drive car around the Nürburgring, and indeed it was the fastest front-wheel drive car around the Nürburgring until VW came along with a car with no rear seats and supposedly took the record away. But a lot of people, the styling was just a bit too much. They couldn't quite understand why the Honda Civic Type R in the past had been something that was outwardly a normal Honda Civic, but underneath was something completely different. This was complete role reversal, you know. Outside it looked nuts, and that just wasn't right for some people. The real controversy though was with the engine, because whereas all Type Rs before it had been naturally aspirated VTEC engines, with this car, with the FK2, Honda decided to turbocharge it for the first time. It's not a proper Type R, some people kind of moaned, and frankly I just didn't get it. Turbocharged engines are the way performance cars are going. I mean, Ferrari now do turbocharged engines, McLaren do turbocharged engines, everyone's doing it, and it's just the way performance cars are going, because to get the power you need but also get good efficiency, you need turbochargers. And imagine as well if Honda hadn't turbocharged the new Type R, it would have had, I don't know, maybe 230, 240 brake horsepower. Would you have bought that when Focus RS is more than 300 brake horsepower, Golf R 300 horsepower? I don't think many people would have looked at the Type R if it just had another variation of the same old VTEC engine. Might have been a bit more powerful, but I just don't think people would have given it much attention at all. And you wouldn't have been able to get the economy, so it probably wouldn't have existed in the first place. And yet, as soon as people started to drive these cars, and I remember the first time I got in this car and drove it for the very first time, you realise just how special it is. It might be a turbocharged engine, but 306 brake horsepower, 295 foot-pounds of torque. Those are colossal figures. Performance, 0 to 60, 5.7 seconds, top speed of 167 miles an hour. And I know from having spoken to people who have driven these cars on the Autobahn that they could probably do a tiny bit more than that as well. And the Nürburgring record, 7 minutes and 50 seconds for a front-wheel drive car with 4 seats, with, you know, sat-nav system, radio, cruise control, all of the normal hatchback stuff that you would expect, and yet it's just got this monster engine and this incredible performance. It's a very, very special car. Yes, you might not have liked the style very much, but it was the best front-wheel drive car that Honda could make at the time, and I don't think you could ask for much more from any car company. And now I get to go and try the new one. But first, and now here we are, the FK8 on the Autobahn, although I'm driving quite slowly. I've been waiting quite a while for this car in many ways, but the previous car, the FK2, had quite a short life. It's going to be the shortest production run for a Type R, and it's probably going to be the least of a particular generation of Type Rs that will ever happen. If you think about it, this car now will be exported to America as well as other places in Europe and the rest of the world, whereas the previous car, the FK2, well, that was just for Europe. America never saw that car, so in many ways this will be a less rare car, but as I'm going to go through, there are some quite interesting developments to kind of the Honda have, you know, gone for to try and elevate this above the FK2. Let's start with the heart of the beast. First of all, the engine. It doesn't feel massively different, and in truth it's because it isn't a hugely different engine. There are some very interesting technical changes deep in the bowels of the engine, and I'm not qualified enough, nor do I know enough about it to go into great detail, but there are some big changes. However, power has gone up. So before it was 306 brake horsepower, now it's 316. Torque is the same at 295 foot-pounds of torque. Acceleration is also the same, 5.7 seconds to 62 miles an hour. But the top speed has gone up slightly. It's gone up to 169 from 167 miles an hour. In character, it doesn't feel that different. It also doesn't sound very different from the outside or sound very different from the inside. Although there have been some changes to it that mean it's slightly less harsh as you're on the motorway, for example, but I'll get onto that in a minute. The gearbox on the FK2 was brilliant, and this is also very, very good. Again, it feels like a development. The gear ratios, though, are 7% shorter, so you're moving between the gears that little bit more often, and it just makes it more fun, I suppose. It's such a nice gearbox to use. Why wouldn't you want to be changing gears more often? That said, like the FK2, you don't always need to change gears. You just plant your foot in 6th and it shoots down the road. We did a couple of 6th gear pulls earlier on the Autobahn, and you just put your foot down 6th gear and it builds and it builds and it builds, and then you're doing 150, which is good in Germany. In the UK, less so. That's kind of thrown into jail, lose your license, never see your family again kind of territory. But in Germany, it's quite good fun. The limited slip differential at the front, that does feel different, and I don't know whether it's because, as I'll get onto, the suspension is different and it's actually slightly better, so perhaps the diff doesn't have to do as much work. But the diff in this car doesn't feel as aggressive. It doesn't feel like it's clawing at the road in the same way that the FK2 did. But it does deal with torque steer very, very well. And while we haven't been able to try on the wet, which I would like to do, see if there's any difference there, it just, despite 10 horsepower extra, it just throws the power down to the road, and you just don't get any torque steer. You really don't. I mean, 316 horsepower 10 years ago, you've just been mad. You would have just got horrendous understeer. But today, it's brilliant. It's a really, really clever piece of kit. The suspension has had some quite serious upgrades from the FK2 to the FK8. The front suspension is revised, but the rear suspension is entirely new. It's a multi-link rear suspension setup. But the real change comes from the dampers. It's got new adjustable dampers. Now granted, you did get that in the FK2, but not to the same extent. There you just turn the car on and you were in, let's say, the default mode, and then you can put it in plus R. In this, it's slightly different. In this, you've got Sport, which is the turn it on, that's the mode it's in. You've got Comfort, which is the one below it, and then above that you've got plus R mode. Sport, default mode, it's probably the same as it was before in the FK2. It's the best of both worlds. Comfort is where the real difference is for me, because in the FK2 it was comfortable, it was a fairly good ride, but in this, the FK8, because you can slacken off the dampers even more, it just makes it so much more compliant and easy to live with on the road. I could see myself doing a longer journey in this than I could in the FK2. And then there's plus R mode, and plus R mode feels fairly similar to the plus R mode in the old FK2. It really does ramp it up. It gets very, very stiff to the point where if you're not on a racetrack or a very, very smooth road, you shouldn't really be in that mode, because it will just bob you around too much, and then you won't get the power down, you won't get the most out of the chassis. The brakes, well, they're fairly similar again to the FK2. Up front, you've got ventilated and drilled Brembo discs as well as Brembo calipers, 4-piston calipers, 350mm at the front, and then at the back you've got 305mm solid discs. And they're very, very powerful. Again, they feel quite similar to the FK2. They're strong, like you can just scrub off speed at a tremendous rate. It took about 3 minutes last night in the press conference for someone from Honda to mention this car's Nürburgring time, and a lot of that has to go down to the brakes. You can't do, a 7-minute 40 lap of the Nürburgring without good brakes. And as for the grip, well, this is a slightly interesting one. On the road, it feels just as grippy, just as agile. On the track, I wonder whether the tyres was probably seen better days, because we're starting to get some understeer in the car. But what I like is that there's adjustability, both at the front axle and the rear axle. Like if you come on the brakes, for example, and you start to turn in and lift off, you can feel the rear just go light and start to kind of rotate on you a little bit. And at the front, again, going too hot, obviously you get understeer, but for the most part, if you just scrub off the speed that you need to and point, it just zips in and you're away. It's really, really impressive, the grip levels on this car. As for the steering, variable ratio electric power steering system, and that is one of the big differences between this, the FK8 and the FK2. The FK2 had a lovely, lovely steering system, and you could feel exactly what was going on the tyres, and again, you get that here. But because of this change of steering system and the fact that you now get more angle at the wheels, you know, once you put angle in on the steering wheel, proportionally more angle, it just makes it a little bit more usable. Like, you don't have to move your hands around on the wheel, and it's one of the things that makes, you know, driving the new standard Civic better than the old 9th generation Civic is down to the steering and the fact that you just don't have to put in as much work at the wheel. What about the design though? FK2 I actually quite like. I like the fact that that was a hot hatch where it looks fairly outrageous, and you get other hot hatches on the market that looked quite understated, and it certainly drew attention. And actually, I thought it was quite a pretty car. This, on the other hand, I'm still not sure of. I'm warming to it, and it certainly does look very, very mean, very menacing. And I like the fact that all of the aerodynamics, everything that you see on the outside, does have a purpose. Everything is there for a reason. It's funny because every generation of Type R has got probably that little bit more detailed and intricate, and you see the EP3, the FN2 and the FK2 side by side, and it looks like a kind of a nice evolution, although they're kind of getting that little bit more outrageous with every generation. And then you put this next to it, and even next to the FK2 it does look a bit bonkers. Now the only thing left to do is to drive both side by side on the same day on the same roads, because then I think you'd really start to feel the changes and the differences and the benefits of this new platform. Which one do I prefer? Well, at the moment, I suppose I'd have to say FK2, because I've spent a lot more time in that, I've got to know it, and it does feel, yeah, it's quite a raw car. And perhaps this doesn't feel quite as raw. It's very, very fast, very, very effective, and it's still a very full-on experience, and you need to work with the car to get the best out of it. But is it as full-on? I don't know. I think I'd need to try both back to back.